Well, good morning, my friends. We are in a series right now called Controversial Conversations. And today, we are going to start off talking about racism. Racism. I am just about as white as it gets. I mean, I suppose you could probably get a little bit more white than me. Could have a little bit blonder hair, maybe, or more freckles than I do, but I'm just about as white as it gets. My last name is Whiting, actually. It does not refer to the color of my skin or my ancestors' skin. It's actually a fish in the North Atlantic. We don't have it here. People tell me it's good. I've never had it. When I was in grade 9, in my PE class in high school, my PE instructor would call us out by last name, because that's what he liked to do, and he had kind of a thick accent. I don't know where he was from, somewhere in the American South. And he would call me, every time he would call out my name, he would very clearly say, Whitey, Whitey, all right, is Whitey here? And I had to say, yes, I'm here. Very embarrassing part of my life. I grew up not that far from here, about a 3-hour drive to the south. And the culture where I grew up is very similar to the culture in British Columbia, in the Lower Mainland. And as I grew up, I thought about racism as something that happened very far away or a long time ago in the past. It was obvious to me that I was not racist, and neither was anyone in my family or my community as far as I could tell. It was something very removed from my life and where I lived. There were some people of other races, or at least visibly of other races, in the place where I grew up, but not very many. My high school, for example, unlike some other high schools in the region, probably had maybe, 3 or 4 black people in the high school, and maybe 10 or 20 Asians out of 600, 700 students. So not very many. So I grew up thinking that racism was something very far away, or that had only happened a long time ago. When I was a young adult, after I graduated high school, I decided I wanted to go see different parts of the world. And so I took off and went a long way away to university, and I spent 3 years of my university time in New Orleans, Louisiana. When I got there, I saw racism everywhere I looked. Everywhere I looked, I could see it, and it was shocking to me. When I got off the plane and arrived at the university, the very first thing that I noticed was that 98.5% of the student body in the university were white. And the 1.5% that were black were all athletes on scholarships. And 99.5, probably something like that, percent of the maintenance workers, the kitchen staff, the janitors that worked at the university were black. Within a 5-block radius of that university, it was almost entirely white people who lived there. But if you walked beyond that, it was seemed like 100% black, the neighborhoods. Now, the amazing or astonishing thing to me at that time was, as I talked with my friends who were from there, both white and black for the most part, they could not see the racism that I saw. Most of them thought of racism as something that happened a long time ago or far away, just like I had thought of it in the place where I grew up. And this is an astonishing thing about racism, which shouldn't be surprising because it's also true of sin in general, is that it is often invisible to the people who are trapped in it. We can't see it sometimes. I had a lot of amazing experiences in New Orleans. I was able to tutor just a couple of students in a public school. I was the only white person in that setting. And it was very cross-cultural. It was hard for me to even understand what the students were saying sometimes, even though we were all speaking English. It was remarkable. I grew to love the students that I was teaching there, but I always felt like an outsider in that situation. I never felt like I was part of what was going on. I also, while I was there, I became a follower of Jesus while I lived there. And for about a year, I attended a black missionary Baptist church in one of the black districts in New Orleans. And that was a remarkable experience as well. I loved it. They did not call me the white kid or whitey. They called me the blonde-haired boy. That's what they called me, which was very nice of them. They cooked me. The women baked me lots of stuff. People were very encouraging to me. They allowed me to get up in front of the church sometimes and give testimony. Well, I loved it because it was so lively and so much different than any other church I had been to before. Anybody ever been to a black church in the American South? It is something. I mean, at this church, the pastor, he would do this thing, and I'm not going to try and do it for you. They call it whooping, where he would get so into his sermon, so into the message, that he would start preaching and singing at the same time. There's no other way to describe it. He would preach, sing, and he would spin around in circles and hammer the pulpit with his fist. And the whole church would jump up and down and throw their hats and yell things at him the whole time. Pretty much exactly the opposite of what you guys are doing right now. Hey, there was finally a reaction. That's great. Did you know that first hour is way more responsive than second hour? It is. I don't know why. Every week, first hour is way more responsive. So it is a competition, so just saying. I'm laying that out there. Okay. I like it when you guys respond. So that was a great experience being part of that church for a while. Shout out to Pastor George Washington Jr., who is still a pastor. He lives in Atlanta now. That was my pastor at that time. And yeah, that really was his name, George Washington. Pastor George Washington. Fantastic. So I moved back to Washington State, and then eventually, 16 years ago, I moved to British Columbia. Lived in Vancouver for a while. Now I live in North Delta, close to Surrey, close to the border there. And here, I have also experienced different things having to do with race. I would say I've experienced two things in the area of racism. One, I have experienced some racism directed toward me and my family since I've lived in British Columbia. Now, that's not something that, it's not so horrible. I'm not going to tell you a sob story. My life is not that hard, but I have experienced some. Some of it happened in public schools where my kids were attending. I have, for the most part, since I've lived in British Columbia, lived in neighborhoods that were not predominantly white. And so at one of the schools where my kids were enrolled, at one point, my kids were among a very small handful of white children in the school. And most of my kids are blonde, and they were the only blonde children in the school. And definitely, it wasn't terrible, but definitely they were made fun of sometimes by groups of certain ethnicities in that school and excluded from certain things. And I also, racism, I had this conversation this week with someone of a different race who was telling me, I asked her if she had ever experienced racism in British Columbia. She said yes a couple of times in a way that she could tell clearly was racism. But she said, you know what, I feel racism all the time, but I don't know if it's just in my head. And I thought that was a powerful thing to say because that's been my own experience as well, in situations where I've been a minority, which again is not all that often, but it has happened in those schools sometimes. There were things that happened to me that I felt excluded, but I didn't know if it was racially motivated or not. Sometimes it's very hard to tell. I have also experienced what I can only attribute to white privilege a number of times in British Columbia. One time in particular, I'll share with you, this was at one point we had a doctor who was of a different race, different ethnicity, and almost everyone who went to that doctor was of a different ethnicity, visibly different skin color. And I had been warned before I started going to this doctor that you always had to wait a long time to get in to see this doctor. You could have an appointment, but you might wait an hour after your appointment time. And I was like, oh man, that sounds awful. Why am I going to this doctor? Because I really liked him. He was a great doctor. But what happened to me is that each time I went there, I would show up and the waiting room would be absolutely packed with people of a different skin color than me. For sure, Many of them were waiting for my doctor. And every time, not sometimes, every time I was brought in within 5 minutes. And I don't really know why. I kind of hated it, even though I liked not waiting, right? But I kind of hated it because I didn't know what this whole waiting room full of people was thinking. Here I am with my blonde children being ushered in immediately while they all wait. Why did that happen? I don't know. The only thing I can come up with is maybe it was white privilege in some way. So those are some of my experiences around the issue of racism. We're going to dive into this topic today, and it is going to take us 2 weeks. I've spent the better part of 3 months actively preparing for this message. And I tried in first hour to finish it in one week, in 30 minutes. That did not happen. I got halfway through and I realized there's no way. So you've got your notes if you're here on site, and those notes, you're not going to finish them today. I'll give you another copy next week. We're going to go through half of this stuff on racism today. What we're going to do is first we're going to give some context for the Bible. Where does racism fit into the Bible? Then we're going to talk about definitions. So what exactly is racism? What are we talking about? Make sure we're all on the same page. Then we're going to spend most of the time today talking about history and the influence that the Bible has had on the history of racism. And that will set us up. At the end, we'll talk about where we're going for next week. That'll set us up for next week to actually talk about what is the current controversy. And next week, I will give you, where do I stand? What do I think about the current controversy? So next week, there'll be some stuff that's not just the Bible. It'll be my thoughts and opinion as well, which you are fully welcome to disagree with. And we can still be friends, okay? We can still be friends, even if we disagree. This Wednesday, every Wednesday at 7 o'clock on Zoom, it's an online video meeting, I will have a class called Continue the Conversation. So if you want to talk about this stuff, if this brings up stuff for you, if you're mad at me, if you're just interested in hearing more, come to that class and we'll talk about it. It'll be a place where you can be heard as well as learn more about this topic. Okay? So let's dive into first the biblical context. The Bible has a lot to say about racism, but the Bible is not about racism primarily. The main message of the Bible is that the world is totally wrecked, but Jesus can save it. The main message of the Bible is that you are totally wrecked, and so am I, but Jesus can save you, and in fact, He is our only hope. He is real hope. And the stuff that human beings, the garbage, the cycles that we are caught in that seem like they will never end, they will end. They can be escaped because of what Jesus did on the cross and what happened on the third day when He rose from the dead. That is the main message of the Bible. So as we talk about what the Bible says about racism in a few minutes, we need to keep that in context. This is part of the overall message of the Bible, which is Jesus saves. All right, now we need to talk about history a little bit. If we were to look at the news today, which I'm sure, how many of you feel like you watch too much news or read too much news? Yeah, man, I feel like I do. It's important to watch the news, to know what's going on, but it is so discouraging sometimes. And some of the news is so heart-wrenching so often, especially during this last 6 months. The news around racial tension all over North America is absolutely awful. And so if we were to look at the news and take that as our main or only source of input, we might think, man, the world, when it comes to racism, things are getting worse and worse. The world is spiraling out of control. However, we need to put what is going on now in the context of the history of the human race. Because overall, we have made a ton of progress. And the question we'll address after we go through the history is how? This needs to be explained. We have made a ton of progress, and how have we done it? Okay, so first let me show you that we have made progress. Let's go to our definitions to begin here. What is racism? What are we talking about? Racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. This is just the first definition of racism that comes up when you Google it. But it's a good definition. This is what most people today mean by racism. In some way, we're against someone, whether sometimes it might be conscious, sometimes not, or we prejudge them because of their race or their membership in some particular ethnic group. Another term, which we'll get to mostly next time, that's thrown around a lot now is systemic racism. Systemic racism means racism that is embedded as normal practice within a society or an organization. It can lead to discrimination in a bunch of different areas. So in this case, systemic racism, this idea is very subtle and actually quite hard to wrap your mind around, I have found. But systemic racism, the idea is partly that people might be acting in racist ways or involved in a racist system even though they don't have racist thoughts or feel like they're racist. We'll talk about whether that's true or not. That's part of the controversy. All right, so now that we've got sort of what racism is, what are we looking at? What is the history of racism in the human race? If we go back a couple of thousand years and further, the history of racism in the human race is 100%. It's 100%. If we go back to any ancient culture, the view of the world that those ancient cultures, all of our ancestors had, the normal view, there could have been individuals that perhaps escaped this. There probably were. There were different degrees that individuals had of these thoughts, but the cultures as a whole, racism was normal and not even questioned. It was not even something that was considered bad. It was just a thing that was. Every race, every ethnic group, every nation, every tribe thought, we are the good people. We are the good ones. We're the best. And the other people out there are the bad ones. I can demonstrate this by looking at the history of slavery in the world. If we go back a couple of thousand years and look all over the world, slavery was almost universal. In fact, it might have been universal. We just aren't 100% sure about that. But check out this graphic. This is a collage of different images of slavery made in ancient times by the cultures who were enslaving people. This is not propaganda against any group. These are all ancient pieces of art, and they are from all over the world. So let's take a look. This one at the top right is an image of slavery in ancient Egypt. Now that's something Christians are very familiar with because the Bible, the people of God, the people of Israel, were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. If we move down to the bottom right, we find an image of slavery in ancient China. A bunch of slaves serving their master and begging for food. If we move to the bottom left, we find a picture. This is one of these tile artworks from the Roman Empire. This is a picture of Roman slavery. And if we move to the top left, we have a totem pole representing the slavery that occurred in ancient times here on the west coast of North America. Some people have argued that this was not, some of these weren't real slavery. However, in all of these cases, and many more in cultures all over the world, this slavery included things like hereditary slavery. So the people who were slaves, their children would also be slaves. It included the buying and selling of human beings as if they were property, and the ability to pay off a debt by giving a human slave as payment. chattel slavery. It included, not in every case all the time, but the majority of the time all over the world, it included complete control over the slave's life. They were your property. If you were the owner, you had control even over whether they lived or died. And in most of the cultures in the world, it was a known practice to sometimes kill your slaves. Sometimes this slavery was not about, actually often it was not about skin color, but it was most of the time about what tribe are you part of, what ethnicity are you part of, what race are you. Often the races had similar skin colors, but it was a different group of people that was being enslaved. Just like the racism that we talk about today. So you would go to war, you viewed your people viewed your people as the good ones. We are the good people. Whoever those people out there are, they are the bad people. So we're going to fight them, and if we win, we're going to kill some of them, and the rest we're going to enslave them. We're going to own them and control them. This is a demonstration and clear evidence that racism was all over the world in ancient times. It was universal. And this should not be a surprise to us. If we are followers of Jesus, if we've been reading the Bible for any amount of time, it should not be a surprise to us that racism is sort of natural for human beings because human beings have fallen. The teaching of the Bible is that our first ancestors, we are all one family, all of us human beings. The clear teaching of the Bible is that, in fact, all races originate with two human beings. The Bible calls them Adam and Eve, our earliest ancestors, and they did something that was against what God was asking them to do. They committed the first sin, and when they did, all kinds of bad stuff came into the world. The world was broken. And the part of the world that is most broken of all is the inside of human beings. The Bible is all about how do we fix that problem. But that is the part that is most broken of all. And so if all human beings are deeply, deeply broken and wrong on the inside, it should come as no surprise that deep racism is natural for us. What should come as a surprise is that we've made progress. What should come as a surprise is that this isn't the case anymore. If we look at this being the condition of the world a long time ago, you can see that even though I am not saying things are just okay now, they are not. There are deep problems around race right now, and even right where we live. But I think you can agree that we have made a lot of progress as a human race. The question is, how in the world did we make progress? Because whatever that way was that we've made this progress, man, we need to keep going, don't we? What has helped us get out of this and into the place where the world is now? Slavery is not authorized or legal by any government in the world right now. There is some slavery in the world, but it's illegal wherever it is. How did we get here? Let's start to talk about the Bible. We're going to go through a number of Bible passages here. We're going to look at what the Bible has to say about racism. Let's start off in the beginning in Genesis chapter 1. Remember as we read this, what kind of a world these words were first written into. A world where no one even thought that racism was wrong. And here are the words that come in the very first chapter of the Bible, in the creation story. Most cultures' creation stories, do you know what they're about? If you go back far enough, most cultures' creation stories are about where did my people come from? Where did the good people come from? The creation story in the Bible, number one, it's about where did all people come from? And number two, check this out, Genesis 1, verse 27. God created man, that's human beings, in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Right at the beginning of the Bible, we have this vision of what human beings actually are. all human beings. And we see that this verse, if you think about what would this do if every human being in the world thought this way about the other people that they see all the time? What would this do in the world if when I saw another human being, whether they looked like me or whether they looked very different, whether they were part of my people and my clan or whether they were other people from another place, if when I saw them, my first and deepest thought was, there's one who's been created by God. There's one who's been created by God to look like him, to somehow show me through who they are, show me part of what God is like. The God who created the world and who created me. The God who is love. If even this one verse alone were deeply believed and thought about by all human beings, racism would simply cease to exist. Do you see it? There wouldn't be a fight about it anymore. If we could take this all the way deep down into our souls and into our patterns of thought, racism would simply be gone. It would be the end. As we move through the Old Testament, we find lots of references, not only here, but God loves, over and over again in the Old Testament, he says he loves the marginalized, those who are outsiders, the foreigners, those who are looked at in the lowest position in their society. God chose a people out of all the nations of the earth, the people of Israel. He chose them for a mission. And when he chose them, what was their first thought? Their first thought was this: hey, God chose us, we must be the good people, and the rest of the people are all the bad people. And right from the beginning, as God chooses them, he over and over tells them, I didn't choose you because you're the good people. I chose you so you could bless all the other people. I didn't choose you because you were the good people. And then he took them and he allowed them to be slaves in Egypt for 400 years. To be deeply oppressed and discriminated against. And they cried out, why? Why are you allowing this, God? Why? So that he could get it through our thick heads that we're not the good ones and they're the bad ones. So that they would know what it was like to be the oppressed, so that when he brought them out of that, they could love and express care for people who were not like them. Now, they did it sometimes. They made some progress, but progress in this area takes so long. And then, about 2,000 years ago, Jesus himself came on the scene. And let's check out some of the stuff he had to say about this. Probably the strongest statement from Jesus, or the one that's most stands out in my mind the most, is his parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. In this parable, it's very clear that for the people he's talking to, for the Jewish people, the Samaritans are the bad people, the despised people, the people that they hate and don't want to be involved with in any way. And the whole parable is about a despised person who turns out to be the good one. This parable is designed to get inside of us, inside of human beings, and root out racist tendencies. That's what it's designed to do. You probably know some of the parable, most of you. There's a man who's Jewish, so he's from the good people, as they saw it, and he gets beaten up one day as he's traveling and left bleeding and dying on the side of the road. And along comes someone from his own culture and leaves him there and doesn't care because he can't be bothered. And along comes a pastor, a priest from his own culture, his own race, and leaves him there and can't be bothered because he's too busy with the stuff that he's doing. And along comes, finally, one of the bad people, one of the people who's viewed as despised and hated. But inside of that person, inside of that Samaritan, is love. And when he sees this person who, in normal circumstances, would hate him, would make fun of him, would kick him out, would persecute him maybe, when he sees him bleeding and dying on the side of the road, he feels something for him. Because inside of him there is love, and so he helps him. And Jesus' whole point in the parable is this is what happens when we begin to love God. We naturally then love those who are around us, our neighbors, even those who are very, very different than us, even those who hate us. This is what happens to us as we follow God. Let's go to the next verse here. We're going to jump forward to Acts chapter 10. And in this section, Jesus had all this teaching. He tells his disciples, he tells his followers, the last thing he says to them is, hey, here's what I want you to do, okay? You're going to go and you're going to preach this message. Tell everybody the good news about how they can be saved through what I've done on the cross. Go tell all the Jewish people. And then he says, and then go tell the Samaritans. Go tell them, the people that you hate. Go tell them. And then he says, then go tell all the other people in the world, people that you haven't even started to hate yet because you never met them. They're so different from you, you can't even imagine it. But go to all of them and tell them this good news. And what does the church do? For the first 10 years, they really don't do it at all. They only speak the message to those who are just like them because it's comfortable, because it's easy, because they don't want to talk to the Samaritans, because Samaritans are bad. Even though they have decided to follow Jesus, still, deep down, are these tendencies that they've got to view the people who are like me as good and everybody else as bad. And in this verse that we've got here on the screen, what's happened is that God has very, very clearly shown Peter that he needs to go to this guy named Cornelius, who is a Roman centurion. And he needs to go spend some time with him, eat with him, which Peter cannot even imagine eating with someone as disgusting as this Roman centurion. He has to eat with him and he has to teach him the message of Jesus. And this Roman centurion is part of the group that oppresses his own people. The Jewish people at this time in history are dominated and oppressed by the Romans. No doubt this Roman centurion, it's part of his job, has been ordered to crucify people from Peter's own race. And Peter goes, and what he realizes on that day is just what Jesus had been telling him, though he hadn't realized it yet. He had walked with Jesus, and it hadn't sunk in. Here's what he says. When he sees what God has done in Cornelius' family, he says, I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts men from every nation who fear him and who do what is right. God is not looking at the outside. He's not concerned about primarily what is your culture, what group are you connected to. He is looking at what is on the inside. And this is what Peter sees. Next verse. Ephesians chapter 2. This one is quite a complex verse. We dealt with it in a series on the book of Ephesians recently. If you want to know more about it, you can go back and watch some of those messages. But in this section, it's talking about the Jews and the Gentiles. So this is the way the Jewish people described this tendency to think, my people are good and everybody else is bad. They didn't even most of the time talk about what group are you part of if you're not part of us. They just called you all one name. You're either Jew or you're Gentile, and Gentiles are bad. This was the common conception. And here, Paul has been talking about in this letter what Jesus accomplished on the cross. What was it that he accomplished? He says this, he himself, Jesus, is our peace. He has made the two one. He's talking about the Jews and the Gentiles. So all the different racial, ethnic groups, he's made the two one because he's destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. How did he do it? By abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new man, one new humanity, one new people out of the two. And so here, in somewhat complex words, I will admit, is a vision of what God was going for. A huge part of what he's going for in Jesus, in sending his son to earth, to live, teach us, then die on the cross for our sins, rise again from the dead, part of what he was going for was to take all of our division, all of this racial and ethnic division that was like a barrier, a dividing wall of hostility. We could never get through it. And he destroyed it. He made a way through. Sometimes the Bible is criticized for things like not making a law against slavery. Did you know that the Bible does not actually have a command anywhere to not have slaves? It talks about racism a ton, but it does not command an end to slavery. Why? Because commands and laws can never fix the real problem. Jesus didn't waste his time with things that might help a little bit but can't really root out what's wrong with us. He went straight for the root. He went straight for the root and tried to abolish not just slavery, but racism itself, sin itself, by giving up his own body on the cross. And here's the thing, his way works. His way works. So let's talk a little bit more about history of racism and what has happened since the time of Jesus. I said earlier, we've made a lot of progress. If you look at where the world was at thousands of years ago and where we're at now, wow, that is a huge difference, and it needs to be explained. And the explanation, the reason that the world is different now, is the Bible. The reason that the world is different now than it was thousands of years ago is because of the presence of the Word of God and what has happened through the church. Now, do not hear me saying that everything the church has ever done, followers of Jesus have ever done, has been good. Absolutely not. There have been many, many horrific atrocities that have happened by people who claim to be followers of Jesus. But things have changed, and there must be an explanation for how they've changed. Why have they changed? And really, if you go back to the time of Jesus, there are not a ton of voices out there to choose from that are against racism. If you look throughout history until relatively recently, the only voice speaking against racism and trying to cut it out of human hearts is the Bible and the Word of God. That's all there is, really. And so here's our second point for today. I don't even know if I even gave you the first one, but let me put the second one up here. The most effective and consistent voice against racism in all of history has been the Bible. In the days of Jesus, there was slavery everywhere, like we said, and massive racism. And what happened? He changed things by changing the hearts of a few people. And then they went out and his Spirit spread through them. And what starts to happen is a turning upside down of society. Instead of telling people, hey, you have to get rid of your slaves and you're going to set them free and you might still hate them, but at least they're free. Instead of that, he flips everything on its head. He says, you guys are brothers now, master and slave, oppressor and oppressed. You are brothers. You're in the same family. And what starts happening in places where there's been racial division and Christians start having church meetings, they start crossing racial lines. What's the very first place where Christians were called Christians? Does anybody know? Come on, Bible nerds out there. Very first place where Christians were called Christians. Antioch. Yeah, the city of Antioch in what is now modern Turkey, right? And so in the city of Antioch, first place Christians are called Christians, that city was a racially divided city. They actually had walls, and you had to cross with guards between areas where this is where one race lives, this is where another race lives, this is where this race lives. And you can check this out. Historian Rodney Stark has a lot of information on this. You can check this out. What happened, why Christians started being called Christians, is because people didn't know what to call them anymore. Because if you lived in that city, you were called by your name and by the name of whatever group you were part of, right? So you're Cornelius the Roman, right? Or you're Aminadab the Arab, or whatever you are, right? And so what happened is Christians started meeting together and even living together across racial lines. They weren't even really trying to do that. They just knew that they were brothers in Christ and wanted to spend time together because they loved each other. And nobody knew what to call them anymore. Well, I can't call you a Roman now. You hang out with Arabs. What's going on here? I'm lost. So they called them, what do you say you are? Why are you living together? That makes no sense. Well, we're all followers of Christ. Okay, we'll call you Cornelius the Christian now because we don't know what else to call you. And as time goes on, things start to change. Not all at once, not all up and down, certainly. But as time goes on, things start to happen. Like more and more people become Christians in the Roman Empire. And then they start to think about things like, hey, we are followers of Jesus. And he says to love your enemy. And we've got a bunch of slaves and we make them fight to the death in the Colosseum. That might be bad. Maybe we should change that. In fact, a lot of us have died in the Colosseum as well, so let's get rid of that. So things like, when you get to about 300 years in, things like slaves fighting each other to the death goes away by pressure from the Christian churches, which have now become a significant proportion of the population. As we go on, something very remarkable in the history of the world happens. Very remarkable. By the time you get to about the year 500, Christians are getting rid of their slaves. That's something that they're voluntarily doing. And by the time you get to the year 1000, in Europe, in the Christianized areas of Europe and the Mediterranean, slavery has disappeared. This is not something that gets talked about very often. But for the first time in the history of the world, starting in medieval Christian Europe, slavery no longer exists. Now, does that mean medieval Europe was this just awesome place where everybody's rights were respected? No. There was lots of bad stuff still happening in Christian medieval Europe, but something new had come into the world. Something had begun to really change, and that progress has continued, and that progress is because of the influence of the Bible and the followers of Jesus on the culture around them. It really is. I don't think there's any way to get around it. Now, of course, when we get to what happens later, another 500 years after that, is Europeans discover North and South America, right? And when these Christianized, we won't call them all Christians because not all Europeans were Christians. They all maybe thought they were or called themselves Christians, but they certainly were not all Christians. But when many of them get to what they called the New World, they bring back racism and slavery with a vengeance. And we'll be talking about that more and some of the ramifications of that more next week as we talk about things that are closer to our time and the controversies that we still have today. We have made a lot of progress, though there is a long, long way to go. But one thing that we can take away from this today is that progress doesn't come just by making laws or by changing things that happen on the surface. It comes by deep, inner, spiritual transformation of individual human beings. And that's why it's so slow. But it's the only way that it can happen. It's the only way. And Jesus knew it. Do you see? He's the smartest person who ever lived. We keep trying the same thing over and over. It doesn't work. He tries this thing. It looks like it doesn't work. And then 2,000 years later, you go, whoa, what just happened? What just happened? He knows what he's doing. Let's look at it as we move. We're going to wrap up in just a moment, but I'm going to give you the current controversy that we'll be delving into next week. I'll just say what it is. Most of you will already know what it is, but let's pull that up. We're going to deal with these controversies next week. Is racism a big problem in North America today? Is it? There's a big debate about that. There's people on extreme sides. Is it a big problem in Canada? Right where we live, is it a problem? Or is it just a problem for those other people far away and a long time ago? We're going to talk about that. I'll give you my opinion. I would love to hear your opinion and reasoning. I would love for you to think about it with the Bible in mind. That's what I would love. And the next one, we'll also be talking about this next week. Does systemic racism exist? There's a big debate about that. Does it exist? And if it does, to what extent? This is a very hard thing to see. But I'll give you my opinion on this next week, and we'll talk about it more. For right now, I hope that you will go away this week and think about these things. As I've spent months focused on this issue, trying to think about what I would say, how to not just totally destroy myself or destroy things as I talk about it, I have noticed a lot of thoughts and behaviors and feelings in myself that I'm very surprised are there. I'll tell you more about those next week. But I would encourage you this week just to think and pray and look in yourself. Join me in my class on Wednesday night if you want, and we'll continue this conversation. Let's pray now, and we'll continue in worship. Our Father in heaven,